Joining me now is the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Jamie Harrison. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. A lot to dig into here, but I really want to start with, we are just 18 months out from the 2024 election, not that far, even closer to the conventions. What is the DNC doing now in swing states like Arizona and Georgia that flipped Democratic in 2020, or perennial swing states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan to lay the groundwork that maybe people can't see?
Well, Jen, back in February, I saw the president right before his State of the Union. We were all in Philadelphia when we changed the primary calendar. And I told him, I said, Mr. President, I know you're doing the State of the Union. Let me give you the state of the DNC. We have never been stronger coming out of a midterm, going into a midterm, and going into a presidential election. And we're only getting stronger. One of the things that we were able to do successfully in the midterm to beat back the red wave was to invest in the infrastructure of the party. Normally in midterms, the DNC is not the biggest player in the game. You leave that to the DS and the DCCC. But we put $100 million on the ground, and we didn't do it just a few months before the election. Jen, we actually put it on the ground a year and a half. And just to give folks contrast, in 2018, the DNC put $30 million on the ground. We had the largest voter protection program ever in the history of the DNC. And much of that infrastructure that we built in those battleground states for the United States Senate and governor's races and the House races, that infrastructure is still there, and we are building on it right now. So when you ask somebody like John Fetterman or Josh Shapiro or Catherine Cortez Masto about what was the big difference, many of them will tell you that but for the DNC's early investment in their states to build that infrastructure, it was really the linchpin for them to win their elections. And that is the framework by which we go into this presidential election in places like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, Michigan. I feel really, really, really good about where we're going and our effort to make sure that we get Joe Biden and Kamala Harris reelected and that we win races up and down the ballot.
Now, one of the issues that comes up a lot is this issue of third-party candidates on the ballot. We are seeing outside bids like Cornel West seeking the Green Party nomination. We're seeing the potential or rumors that some might decide to run as third-party candidates. What is the DNC's strategy to counter that threat? Because that could have an impact in determining the outcome of the election in 2024.
Well, Jen, as you know, the stakes in this election could not be higher. I mean, you think about the contrast that we have right now. You have a party that is fighting for freedom, for more rights and not less. And you see the most extreme Republican Party that I've ever seen in my lifetime. They're constantly chipping away at the freedoms and the rights of all the American people. So this is not the time in order to experiment. This is not the time to play around on the margins. And what we see is a lot of folks who want to be relevant and try to be relevant in these elections and not looking at the big picture, that we are not going to, we got to reelect Joe Biden. We have to reelect Kamala Harris because there is no third-party candidate that will win this election. It's never happened in the history of this country, and it ain't going to start in 2024. And so we got to stay focused on the fight that we have ahead and at the threat that we see to American democracy, and that's the extremists coming out of the Republican Party.
Now, you, of course, are a South Carolina, from South Carolina, proud South Carolinian, your home state. And as the first primary state, it is supposed to be the first primary state despite ongoing pushback from other states. President Biden is visiting South Carolina this week, reinforcing, of course, how important it is. It is diverse like the Democratic Party base, but it is not a swing state. So my question for you is, why South Carolina? Why not Georgia or North Carolina? Also diverse states representing the base, but more swing states. Why is South Carolina a better choice to be first?
Well, Jen, South Carolina has been in the early state window now for almost 2 decades. And if you look at the other early state parties or states during that time, you look at Iowa and New Hampshire and Nevada, South Carolina has been the best indicator. I think the only primary in which South Carolina did not choose the eventual nominee of the Democratic Party was when John Edwards and John Kerry ran. And the only reason for that is John Edwards is a native of South Carolina. But South Carolina has been the best indicator of who is eventually going to be the nominee of the Democratic Party. And why is that the case? It is the case because for decades, Black voters have been the backbone of the Democratic Party. And what happens in South Carolina has a ripple effect. What happens in North Carolina, what happens in Georgia, what happens in Mississippi, Alabama, and across the country where there's significant African-American population. There's a statistic I love to use from the National Geographic that says 90% of African Americans in this country can trace at least one ancestor from South Carolina. And why is that? It's because 40% of enslaved people who came into this country came through the port of Charleston. And so it really is the glue for a lot of the African American community. It has been the backbone for the Democratic Party. We have saved democracy, as we saw in the last election. And South Carolinian voters, particularly the Black voters, will continue to do that as the first in the nation primary.
There is another state where a number of elected officials have been displeased, I think it's safe to say, about the change in the primary calendar, and that is New Hampshire. They have said they will vote first anyway, which could, of course, set up a scenario where President Biden is not on the ballot there, and a candidate like RFK Jr., who has started a campaign blitz in the state, also has spread conspiracy theories, but seems to have made, at least in some polls, whether they're legit or not, some headway among Democratic primary voters. So 2 questions here. One is New Hampshire. How concerned are you about the impact this could have on November 2024 and that state that Democrats need to win in November? And then I also want to ask you about RFK Jr. and what you do if he ends up winning that state in the primary.
Listen, New Hampshire is a very, very important state, but for 50 years, New Hampshire and Iowa and New Hampshire have kicked off the presidential primary process. And the Democratic Party is a very different party than it was 50 years ago. We're a much more diverse party than we are. And so there's no state that has an ownership for how we kick this off. Now, the one thing I often correct my friends in New Hampshire in, that they love to say that they're the first, but they're actually the second. They've always been the second contest. Iowa, then New Hampshire. Well, the only thing that has changed this time around, they will still be the second contest, but it's South Carolina, then New Hampshire and Nevada following up. And so, the president is going to still compete in New Hampshire in the general election, and we're giving New Hampshire as much time as they need in order to figure out their primary process. But the bottom line is this, Jen: South Carolina is the official first in the primary state for the DNC going in the 2024 election cycle.
And what about RFK Jr.? I mean, it's New Hampshire where he's making a play. He's out there appearing on a range of right-wing outlets. He's spreading conspiracy theories. The DNC has endorsed Joe Biden, but he has made some headway, at least in some polls. So what are you going to do about RFK Jr.?
Well, I think what we're going to do is we're going to continue to make sure that the American people, and particularly Democrats, understand how Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have delivered for them. When I think back on this presidency, and I think back to what President Biden has done in the first 2 years, with a 50-50 Senate on a good day and less than a 5-seat majority in the House, the next presidential term that I think about LBJ. I mean, this has been one of the most successful presidencies in my lifetime, starting with the American Rescue Plan, to the Inflation Reduction Act, to the infrastructure bill, to the CHIPS Act, to all of these things that we have done, transforming the judiciary. I mean, putting almost 50 of the 100 judges, African-American and African-American women, more African-American women on the appellate court than any presidency, all presidencies combined. And I can go on and on how beneficial this presidency has been to the American people. The reason why we go to the polls to vote for president is to get stuff done. Well, tell me what president in my lifetime, in our lifetime, have gotten more done with almost less than Joe Biden has. And so Joe Biden's going to win this primary process. Kamala Harris is going to win this primary process, and they're going to win the general election. And so that's our focus. We are laser focused on that, making sure that we have the infrastructure and making sure that we are telling the story about how this president, in the face of all of the challenges that he inherited from the most failed presidency of my lifetime in terms of Donald Trump, how he has turned America around. I'm very, very proud of the president, and we're going to get it done for him and Kamala Harris in this primary and again in the general election.
DNC Chairman Jamie Harrison, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon.